Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Francis Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Francis Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's guest is sorry if I could talk this today, Dr. Jaclyn Halpern, who's a partner and clinical director of psychology at Playful Therapy Connections. Jaclyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Playful Therapy Connections. What is it? Who do you serve?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a therapy and testing practice. We're based in Maryland. We are both virtual and with physical locations in the North Bethesda, Rockville area and in Frederick. And then we see clients across the DMV virtually and also through SciPact. So we are able to see clients in a number of different states. We offer therapy and testing. Testing is all in person, so the therapy is where the virtual can come in. We also do parenting support, and we see individuals of all ages, from little ones and their parents, all the way up through older adults. And the thing that really stands out for us is that we are a neurodiversity-affirming practice.
And what does that mean for those that might not know?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, it starts with understanding what neurodiversity is. Just like there is diversity in all other parts of life, in plants, in animals, it is the same in humans. And we see that, of course, with things like skin color and eye color, but it's also true about our brains. And so neurodiversity recognizes that all brains are different and that this is normal for humans, just like it would be for all of these other forms of diversity, and that we need different brain styles. And so neurodiversity is the range from what we call neurotypical, or the most common kind of brain, to all kinds of what we call neurodivergent, which would be differences from that neurotypical. And so when we think about a neurodiversity affirming practice, we are a practice that recognizes that, and we don't look at disability as something that is, wrong in the individual, but rather as, if we think about the social model, the difference between the person's needs and the way the environment is set up. The world is set up for neurotypical brains for the most part, and disability occurs when there is a difference between an individual's needs, or the way that they're showing up in the world, and the way the world is set up. And so in an affirming approach, we are strengths-based. We want to understand, what are the strengths that each individual is bringing in? We are presuming competence. This person has needs that they know of. And if they have a different communication style, that is fine. We will figure out how to meet them where we are. And so we're always centering the client's needs. We're looking through that strengths-based model, and then we're thinking about ways to change the environment to support them. What are those accommodations that they need, rather than looking to just change the individual? That doesn't mean there aren't times we're teaching coping skills and helping someone learn ways to cope in the world. But we are not seeing the disability as a problem in the individual, but rather as an interaction between the environment and the individual's needs.
Which makes sense. So you're not forcing, because I know a lot of people with the autism, and they're forcing the eye contact, and they're forcing the touching, and they're forcing the this. It's like, why? If this child is not comfortable, why are you going to make them uncomfortable?
That is so key. So we are not trying to teach people to be more neurotypical. We want to figure out what helps them to thrive, what is comfortable for them. And a lot of what you're describing is based on what we call like neuronormative expectations, right? To make eye contact, to sit quietly in the classroom and not need to wiggle and move around. And while these things may be different, they're harmless. They're not doing anything wrong in these moments. And looking for those ways of self-regulating, of feeling more comfortable, actually allows someone to show up more authentically and more successfully most of the time.
Right, especially in an education setting, right?
Yes.
So how would therapy look different when it's neurodiversity affirming?
Great question. So therapy is different in that the client's needs are really centered, and it is non-directive. And again, that doesn't mean that if someone comes in and they want to learn something that we can offer them, we're not going to teach it. We still use evidence-based modalities, but it's very much about saying, what do you feel like you need? And that's true whether we're working with a little one or an adult. So of course, parents and caregivers, their needs are talked about with the child if it's appropriate for that child, but it's meeting the child where they are. What do they need in that moment? So we may take a very long time building rapport, even beyond what you would expect in kind of traditional therapy. And if a client shows up on a day and they are just not in a space to do more kind of what we think of as typical therapeutic work, that is fine. We will sit and spend hours engaging in their special interests with them. We will spend time talking about anything that they're interested in. And while that may not seem initially therapeutic, often what we're doing is creating a space that they don't have anywhere else where they can be fully themselves, express their needs, and have that validated, have that be safe. And know if I come here, if I show up here, I can be embraced fully as I am. And often over time, we start to find that people are saying, okay, now I'm ready to, talk about what's bothering me and talk about my struggles, or show you that through my play, if it's a child, or, to think about like, where's the disconnect for me? Where is that happening? And often with our older clients, more so, not necessarily our little ones. For autistic ADHD individuals, we are talking about unmasking, which is learning to be more authentically themselves and not have to always kind of meet those neuronormative expectations, which we are now learning through emerging research causes a lot of emotional damage. There are times and places where people have to show up as expected and times and places where they don't. And looking at when someone can be authentically themselves and also kind of erase some of the messages they've gotten in their life, often through school, about how wrong or bad or problematic they are, and understanding that instead through a lens of self-compassion and through that affirming space, so that we can undo a lot of those kind of shaming voices that people have internalized and rebuild who they are through that new understanding.
Yeah, that's so true. And building that rapport, because you're not going to get somebody to open up. I mean, same with an adults. We're not going to go open up about our deepest, darkest feelings until we, have that connection with somebody.
Exactly. And so therapy may also look different. If someone is virtual and there's a day that they don't want to talk and they want to type, no problem. If there's someone who is using an AAC device, we'll figure out how to make that work for their therapy. If it's a day that they don't want to be on camera, ethically, we have to check in and know where they are and know that they're safe. And then if their camera needs to be off for some of the session, that's okay too. So we really try to say, what are your needs today? In our offices, we try to be extremely sensory friendly. We can change the lighting. We have tons of fidgets and sensory objects. So anything we can do to create felt safety and comfort.
Yeah, which is so important, because you're also not going to open up if you're not in a safe space,
Exactly.
And I love how you say that letting them become more comfortable with who they are.
Yes.
I mean, that's something, our neurotypical kids have the same, and adults have the same, right?
Exactly.
But for our neurodiverse kids, it's even stronger, because our ADHD kids, they can't sit still. And you know what difference does it make? It's okay if you're paying attention.
Yeah.
And I talk about this a lot. When I taught kindergarten, I had a little boy. He was never diagnosed, but it was clear ADHD. Well, he would be up doing my bulletin boards.
Yeah.
He needed to be doing something. At any point in time during a lesson, I could ask him a question and he'd be able to respond.
Absolutely.
But he needed that to be able to do, to keep that. And like, that was like a cool thing. Because for me, that was way back when, but that's the thing. Like, why do kids have to sit still in their seats for 6 hours a day? Right.
And it's hard when you have kids who need quiet and need calm, and then there's someone around them who's needing to move. Then we have to think about, how can we design a classroom that meets all of those needs, right? How can we make sure that the kids who need to move can move? The kids who need to talk and sing while they're working can talk and sing while they're working. And the other kids can have the quiet that they need. And that's where, the universal design model is wonderful for that. It's still not perfect, but if we can look at how can we design a classroom to meet all of these different needs and shift our expectations so that kids can show up to learn in the best way that they can, it's ideal. You mentioned eye contact. One of the things about eye contact is a lot of autistic kiddos will tell you, if I'm making the effort to make eye contact, everything else goes away. It's hard for me to track the conversation. It's hard for me to learn because it is so uncomfortable for me. And if I can shift my eyes, if I don't have to look at the teacher, I'm going to take that in better. For the ADHD kids, sometimes the autistic kids too, if they can fidget, if they can use a sensory tool of some kind, they feel more regulated and they can show up more easily in that learning environment as what they need to be to take in the information and to perform at their highest, which is probably going to look different day to day.
And that's a conversation I have often in IEP meetings of the, when you're masking, when a child's like, I have to sit still and I have to pay attention and I have to look forward and I have to do this. All of their energy is focused on that.
Yes.
Whatever's going on in the classroom is lost.
Exactly.
They're not available for learning, right?
Exactly. And there's many things that we can't control that can make a kiddo not available for learning. But if we can be more open to those different learning styles and change, where people sit, how they sit, do they need to sit, how are they fidgeting, what are they needing to show up, then we can prime them to be more available for learning. And they're still going to have days where there are emotional factors or there were things that happened at home or social factors that we can't control impacting them, but we're going to set them up for success far more frequently.
And that's, it brought up one thing for me for people, like preferential seating is always like the big one. And everybody thinks preferential seating means next to the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what
not
it
true.
means.
Yeah.
And what I have them write in the IEPs on the clarify location of manner is usually that the student and teacher will decide where the preferential seating should be.
Yeah.
And will be checked in periodically. And there will be an alternate location that the child knows of if they just can't.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's like, this is your primary seat, but there's different seating options in the classroom, or there's somewhere else you can go. You can go lay on the floor or sit on the cushion or whatever it might be as they're working throughout the day, or they can stand up and move to do their work, right? Depending on the nature of that lesson and what their needs are, which are going to change.
Yeah. And yeah, as you said, the needs are going to change and it, look different in every class, because sometimes it works here and for every student. And then I was going to say that having the options and knowing the options are there are so helpful also.
Yes.
Because then the child's not sitting there thinking, I can't sit here. Where am I supposed to go? What can I do? Right?
Yep. Exactly.
And it's saving the brain power for learning.
Yeah. Precisely.
So neurodiversity-affirming testing. How does that look? Because it's all standardized tests, right? So how do we tweak that?
Yes. So, and people often worry, is neurodiversity affirming still based in science? Yes, of course it is. We have a lot of information coming out of the relational neurosciences, not even related to neurodivergence, about attachment and connection and co-regulation and understanding, a fight or flight reaction. And we know our neurodivergent kids are just more sensitive. Their nervous system is more primed towards those fight or flight reactions. And so the research is there and it's emerging. And we're using that not just in the therapy, but also then in the testing. So yes, standardized measures. There are not that many affirming measures out there. There are a couple. There are more for adults right now than there are for kids. And so we're still having to use those standardized measures, but we are interpreting them a bit differently. And there's a couple ways that shows up. One is that we haven't yet captured fully in the DSM and the ICD, which we're using for diagnostic coding, the full breadth of what autism and ADHD and other forms of neurodivergence are. But that research is coming. Often it looks different in female and non-binary presenting individuals than it does in kind of traditional understanding of what autism is, if we're talking about autism. And we're seeing more subtle presentations as well, and understanding things like stimming. We often think about things like flapping or spinning, but more subtle ways that people stim, rubbing their legs, playing with their hair, playing with their fingers, cracking their knuckles. There's all kinds of things that people have learned to kind of make it more socially acceptable based on neurotypical social norms. And we're beginning to see, hey, there's a lot of ways it shows up that fly under the radar. And we are asking questions to uncover that a lot more. Because these diagnoses are neurodevelopmental, we go way back in time. So a large part of the testing is based in clinical interview, both just regular old, we're asking questions, and then also using measures like the MIGDAS or a modified version of what's called the ADI to ask these questions that take us back through developmental history. And when I say modified, we are still standardized, but as we are writing up the reports, we're changing the language to be more affirming. So we're thinking through strengths. We're talking about things like vulnerabilities and differences rather than words like impairment and deficit and disordered. And if we think about this, our kids eventually grow up and they read these reports. And we really want kids and adults who read their reports to be able to say, that's me. And I'm okay with how this describes me. Every person's brain is different. Everyone has strengths and everyone has vulnerabilities. And these are mine. And because of the pattern of my strengths and vulnerabilities, we can call this autism. That's the way that it shows up. But that doesn't make it bad, right? And so that is part of that affirming approach. So much of about it is the language that we are using to describe the measures, to describe the behaviors, to describe the traits that people are showing, rather than that more disordered language that we've seen for so long. So we're still looking at the same presentation, but we're framing it in a much more positive way, which makes a difference for the individuals. And of course, the goal is for society to begin to recognize this in a different way and not have so much shame and sort of that sense of like, this is different and therefore it's bad or wrong, but rather this is different. And, any person can bring wonderful things to the table. And this is true when we're testing kiddos who have lower support needs or higher support needs. And people will say, well, does the affirming model work for kids with higher needs? Maybe they're not communicating in traditional ways. Yes, there's still a lot in there. And if you can get to it, every person has a lot to offer. And it's harder work for the kiddo or the adult. It's harder work for the caregivers, absolutely. But there's still strengths there. And there's still a lot to uncover that's positive. And if we can focus there, we create a much more friendly environment for the individual and for the caregivers and how they're perceiving things. And that doesn't mean there's not a lot of support needed. It just means that we can reduce some of that stigma and some of that pressure.
Yeah. That's, it brought up and made me start thinking about like all of my kids on the spectrum that are nonverbal.
Yeah.
And how that's such a challenge, because I know there's allegedly, or there are, nonverbal IQ tests and all that other stuff. But if a psychologist that's just met this child or met them once or twice is doing it, can they really pull everything out of what's in that child's brain?
Not always.
What they know,
Yeah.
right?
So non-speaking kids, they still have a way of communicating. And there are some wonderful people in our area and around around the world who are doing great work at figuring out what are those different AAC kind of forms of communication that different people need so that it can work for them. And there's a wonderful book, The Reason I Jump, that was written by a non-speaking autistic person about their own experience in the world. And, many of these people are dismissed as being lacking in intelligence because they're non-speaking. And it's a question of figuring out how can we get to them? How can we communicate? And we do have autistic people who also have intellectual disabilities. And of course, then it's harder. We have to figure out how to meet all of those needs. But we can do it. So if a psychologist is sitting down with someone, we have to recognize that there are limits to the testing. And so in terms of neurodiversity affirming testing, we are talking about that. So much of what we write about is the observations, what was happening in this moment, and not just the data of the test itself, the standardized measure, but what was happening, because that gives us such insight. If attention, if sensory needs, if other needs are impacting performance, communication needs, we know, okay, this is giving us an idea of how someone might show up day to day in a similar environment, but it may not be telling us what their true capability is. And of course, we have to slow down. We have to spend time trying to connect with that person and figure out how to help them feel comfortable enough so that they can communicate in their best possible way so that we can figure out what they know. Sometimes we can get it, sometimes we can't. We see a lot of PDA individuals, which we affirmingly call pervasive drive for autonomy. And with PDA, a lot of times we can't get the person to show up, in the testing in a way that allows us to assess their full ability. But we're getting a lot of information about the demands that are hard for them. We're getting a lot of information about how they manage when they become overwhelmed and they can't, perform at their highest level. So the testing is still very helpful, even if we're not getting their full ability level. We are learning so much about how their brain shows up in the world and what their needs are. And maybe, in a couple of years, we can test again, having supported those needs more, and we'll get a better idea of their full ability level that second time or that third time. Or maybe they don't need more testing because we've put the supports in place based on what we saw the first time. So in some ways, we're shifting our goals of the testing, not to necessarily reflect what is their full ability, but what are those needs and how can we support them in that positive framework of the problem is not them. The problem is the interaction between them and the way the environment is set up.
Yeah, my daughter's physical therapist, Gabrielle, says all the time, It's like when there's issues, it's because they're not getting a need met.
That's right.
A sensory need,
Right.
whatever it is, they're not getting a
Right.
need. And you said earlier also that behavior is communication. And that's such a big one with me, with my kids that are nonverbal, because they're like, well, we don't know what triggered it.
Yeah.
There's a trigger. There's Take
there's
the time,
there's
right?
a trigger or many triggers, and that's
Right.
the thing, right? We often think about it. I always use this model. I've got my water bottle, right?
Yeah.
So let's just say we've got this water bottle, right? Often what ends up happening is, we get to the point of overflow. And we are looking for, in traditional behavioral models, we're looking for what was that antecedent behavior? What was that one
Right.
thing that caused the problem? The issue is, most of the time, it's not that one thing. That one thing was the last thing that made the cup overflow or the bottle overflow. You have all of these things building up all the time until overflow happens. So that last thing, sure, that was a trigger. But if the person had been down here, would that have caused the same overflow? Probably not. And our neurodivergent kiddos and adults, they're, often they're not starting here. They're starting here. Their bottle is almost full because of the masking, because of the level of needs that they have, because their nervous system is overwhelmed by sensory stimuli and social expectations and meeting neurotypical norms, that there's not a lot of space before that dysregulation happens, before that overflow comes. And so in both therapy and testing, that's a lot of what we're addressing. How do we kind of bring that level down? How do we put in support needs so that we're not sitting here all the time? Right? So that we can understand, and we're looking for the whys beneath the behavior always. Why is this happening? But we may not always know. And there usually is not one why. It's all the different whys. But if we know that there's a why beneath the behavior and that we're looking through, as Ross Green would say, a can't versus won't kind of lens. He's a wonderful doctor who has wonderful materials that help all kinds of kids, but particularly neurodivergent kids. If we can say this is a can't behavior, not a won't behavior, there's an unmet need or a skill that isn't developed yet, we're going to be gentle. We're going to be kinder. We're going to be calmer. We're going to be more empathic to those needs. And then we can bring things down. And so the testing looks for where do we need that? And the therapy also does the same thing.
Yeah. No, it's so true, because people are like, I don't know, they just went from 0 to 60. No, they didn't.
No, they were sitting at 58, 59.
90, 50 to 60. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's what we don't see, and I don't put it on the teachers, because I don't expect the teachers to be able to do it, because there's not enough support, and that's a whole nother topic.
Yes.
But, our education system needs to change a little bit and get that behavior support in there and get the OTs looking, to see what's happening. Because that's a big thing okay, the kid doesn't need direct services. We know that. That's fine, but there's sensory needs there. And the OT can help observe and figure it out, and what that need is. Like the weighted blanket is something used, or pushing, doing heavy lifting, like whatever, or using the Snuggie thing, or hugging a stuffed animal, like whatever that is.
Kick bands, fidgets, movement, right? The ability to get up and move, changing the lighting, having the headphones on, being able to listen to music that's calming. There's all kinds of things that can be done, and it's going to be different for every child, because everyone's sensory need is different. Their profile is going to be different. It's not one size fits all, not at all.
Right, exactly. So, like, looking at the school based on IEPs and 504, what are some things that parents might want to request in
Yeah.
accommodations to be neurodivergent?
Oh my goodness,
affirming?
there's so many, and it's hard because the nature of the IEP is not affirming as of right now, and even the way that behavioral plans are written. So we're looking to shift language a little bit in the same way that we are with the testing. So can we move away from looking at things as impairments and think about them as vulnerabilities that we can support or build skills around? And so, introducing that to a team that hasn't heard it before, and it is getting better, is something that a parent can do, right? And thinking about, that can't versus won't lens, right? When teachers are frustrated and school staff is frustrated, often it's about, we want this behavior to change. And if we can shift to that can't versus won't, and we can help the team see dysregulation rather than behavior problem, we are starting from a better place, and the IEP or 504 is going to be written differently. So for me, one of the main keys is, how do we shift that understanding and that language? So there's some education parents can bring in. And then also, how can we focus on regulation? Because if a child is regulated, they are primed for learning. And so to regulate, we're thinking about those sensory needs. We're thinking about what is overwhelming them in the environment. Is it the learning? Is it the social? Is it the sensory? How can we support it? So I'm looking for, when we're writing an IEP, goals around self-advocacy. And that may look different. It may not be verbal communication, and that's okay. There are other ways to communicate other than speaking. And so how can a child self-advocate for their needs? What do they need to be able to show the teachers or the staff member, I need a bathroom break, I need a movement break? And how can we make that easier for the child to do? As you mentioned, getting an OT involved, asking for an OT to do an eval in the classroom and an observation at the very least, to figure out what are those sensory tools that we can move into the classroom. And then it's moving away, and this is the hardest part, from those traditional behavioral models in school that are based in both punishment and reward, right? They're compliance based. So as I already explained, the problem with just looking at the most recent trigger is that we're missing everything underneath that's leading to dysregulation. So how can we step back and look at the larger picture for this kiddo? And if we can move away from things like behavior plans and, sticker sheets, because even if we think that we're doing something positive, they can be inherently shaming, right? Other kids often see these, and they might have more stickers than the other person, and they recognize, oh, that kid's not getting them, and they're making snap judgments, or even worse, when they're on the wall, right? And we've got the behavior charts with the clips, and everyone can see someone who's struggling, and it looks like they're a bad kid, and they're not. So moving away from that, knowing that even if we think it's positive, it's often shaming. If we tell a kid, okay, you make it to school, 3 times this week on time, you get a prize at the end of the week. Well, what if the kid can't? But if we say, hey, every time you make it to school 3 times, without that timeline, we're making it a little bit better. And then we've got some incentive, because the kid is always working towards something. If we need to use a rewards-based system at all, that's the kind of tweak that we can use. If that is motivating for the child, if it is incentivizing and not shaming, because often the failure to meet those expectations, which is often based in a can't versus a won't, is so shaming. And we get that internalization of, I'm the problem, I'm doing something wrong. And so for me, there's many, many things that we can get into an IEP or a 504 that could be helpful, but that is such a key feature of it. Moving away from anything that would be shaming and moving towards, how do we help with regulation? As you said, a teacher has too many kids in their class, too many expectations to be able to co-regulate all the time. But how else can that kid get that need met? Can they go take a break somewhere else? Is there another staff member in the school who can provide it? Can they self-regulate if they can go get a drink, get some movement, go to a different classroom for a little while, go somewhere else in the school? And can we get that written into the IEP or 504 plan in order to help them? Because if we can get the regulation, a lot of that stuff is going to change in terms of the outward expression of behavior.
Yeah. And I've seen with the behavior modification plans where they totally crash and burn, because the child 90% of the day was doing so awesome and so well. And that last 10% was an oops. And that they didn't get their reward because of that.
Yes.
And so now they've learned 90% of the time, why bother if I'm not going to get it anyway, right?
Or they have a problem earlier in the day that shuts them off from the reward, and then why bother? And it's that sense of I'm the problem. And so, there's so much shame, even when we're looking at more of like a PBIS model, which is a positive behavioral model, instead of something like ABA, where we're looking at both reward and consequence. That issue is there of what if I can't meet it? And that internalized shame and the external judgment. I want to also say the other thing that I would really look for in an IEP is centering what the child needs. So a lot of times for autistic kiddos in particular, but we see it with ADHD'ers as well, we're thinking about social stories and we're thinking about teaching social skills. And again, those things often are geared towards how to make the person more neurotypical or how to manage in a wholly neurotypical, environment. And if we can instead invite the child to talk about what they need in that environment, or to show that, or we can help identify that if they're not able to communicate it themselves, we can write a social story that is very, very different, that helps them understand what accommodations they have available to them to use in those moments and how their particular needs and their way of communicating can show up in that moment as acceptable completely and expected and welcomed. And so some of that is also, hey, our teachers, this is not going to ever go into an IEP or 504, I don't think, but can teachers educate the whole class on different kinds of brains and learning styles and, sensory needs, and making it okay for someone to communicate without eye contact or, more bluntly, or, in a different kind of way, whatever that might look like, so that it's not just that autistic or ADHD or otherwise neurodivergent kid being asked to change and, fit in with the neurotypical kids. How can we make them show up as they are and have those neurotypical kids totally accept and welcome them? And there's a lot of ways to do that. Again, not going to happen probably in the 504 or IEP, but if we can create that openness, that child can show up more as themselves. And then we're also reducing the likelihood of dysregulation.
Yeah. And that gives me some good ideas for IEP goals, because that's a big one I see so many times. Child will use coping strategies to self-regulate 40% of the time. I'm like, what coping strategies?
Right.
Who's teaching the coping strategies, right?
Exactly.
And who's determining what coping strategies? And how do you know if they're using a coping strategy or not? How do you know what I mean? Like
100%
measurable, right?
Right.
And they make me crazy. And that's the same thing with behavior intervention plans. Like, it's the same thing of like, how do you know when it comes to that? It's such a hard thing to know. I have a client that and I've gotten this into other IEPs also, that they have the behavior chart, but at the end of the day, the teacher writes their comments also, and they compare so that the child can see, oh, this is how I graded myself for the day, and this is what the teacher saw, and they can have that discussion of what was different and why.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a nice way of doing it. And I think, at least that allows them to see that there are different ways of interpreting, but also the teacher hopefully can see, if the teacher is kind of more shaming of the child, what was going on for the child in that moment, right? What was the dysregulation happening in the child that the teacher completely didn't pick up on that led to whatever that challenge was? Because then we have another area that we can understand and say, okay, how can we help here? And, that expectation, going back to your example of self-regulation, that may well be an area where a skill hasn't developed yet, and asking the child to self-regulate may not be possible. But then we go to, how do we build in the co-regulation if the teacher can't do it? So who's providing that support? How, when, where, why? What coping skills are going to be tried? How are we going to know if they're working? What sensory tools can be, used? And what can we do in the environment so it's not all on the kiddo to make those changes, which is a big one.
Yeah, but I was also going to say what's also important is that using the coping strategies before the dysregulation.
Yes, 100%. Bringing them in, knowing.
Once you're dysregulated, your brain is not in let me think of what I can do. Like, you're done.
Right. It's a fight or flight reaction. And
Yep.
the other thing to kind of think about is the fawn reaction. Some of our kids who look like they're doing great, they are perfectionistic, they are well behaved, they don't make a peep other than to participate, right? They may not be so okay. And that they may break eventually too. So being aware and knowing that these are different ways it can show up when someone is kind of shut down or frozen, even if they look regulated, they may not be. And we have to help those kids too. We have to be able to figure out what strategies, can we use for all of the kids. What can they each come up with? I mean, again, I'm going into that sort of ideal universal design
Right.
model. But, for any kid, yes, how do we get those things in place before the moment of dysregulation?
I was gonna say that's where you come in, because through
Mhm.
therapy with you and the therapist in your company, you're teaching the kids outside of, like, so that they can then
Yeah.
hopefully use it in school, right?
We are. I mean, and again, it comes down to, like, when I say teaching, it is about them having the opportunity to practice what they feel will be helpful for them. And of course, we're providing ideas, right? If there's something that they're struggling with or their parents say they're struggling with, yes, we will help them figure out what are those tools that might work. And then hopefully they can carry over. We have to recognize, though, that just because a child can tell us what they should do, or could do in the moment that would be helpful to them, doesn't mean that in the moment they can, because they
Right.
go into that fight or flight mode. They're in that dysregulated brain space and they can't use those tools. And that's true of neurotypical kids too.
And adults.
And adults, yes. And so recognizing just because they know it doesn't mean they can use it. And we may have to change. We may have to look at, well, what's working and what's not. And yes, we can do that in therapy. It's a wonderful thing to be able to bring in the therapist or the occupational therapist or the speech language therapist into those meetings as well, so they can provide information about what they are seeing is working and what they're seeing in terms of the kids' needs, because that can also help the team understand what may be underneath the behaviors that they're seeing or the challenges they're seeing, and what they can do to help, because it's working in other situations too.
Right.
Bringing in, the OT or the speech therapist that knows the kid, into the classroom on how to help too can make a difference.
Right. That makes me crazy also, because a lot of the school systems won't let the outside providers into the
Yeah.
school. And
Yeah.
it's like, we're just trying to work. I get it that they don't want them to come in to provide services, because
Right.
that's a whole nother thing with
Yeah.
providing FAPE and who's
Yeah.
doing it. But if they want to come in and help and do an observation and just do an observation and then give the teacher some pointers, like,
Yeah.
why not?
Right. Right.
You know,
Exactly.
I'm sure the teacher
Exactly.
wants the support. The
Yeah.
teacher would be, like, all for it. Like,
Yes.
if you can figure out how to make my life easier, like, one kid at a time, let's go, right?
100%. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. And I think, the other piece of this that I didn't say before when I'm thinking about IEPs is the social decoding. So rather than teaching neurotypical social skills in a way that is like, hey, this is what you're supposed to do it. It's more about saying, hey, let's talk about what was happening for you in this moment. Let's talk about what a neurotypical person might be expecting and why there was a disconnect there. Now that we understand that, how do you want to handle it? What's going to work for you? And how can we help your peers understand that that's going to be your reaction? So again, not just saying, yo, you got to be like this. That's
Right.
not what we're doing, right? It's much more of a, hey, we're going to figure out how to help you be yourself. And we're going to help you figure out what's happening around you so that you don't feel lost and so that you can interact with your peers, but do it as authentically yourself, not as you trying to be more neurotypical. And that can be built into an IEP.
It can be. It's challenging, but it can be. When you get schools to listen,
Yes, you're right. It
which
takes the right team.
right, and it's hard. I mean, it's hard for parents. They don't always listen to me either, you know? The plus of bringing an attorney is that the central office usually comes and their attorneys come, so it just changes a little bit.
Yeah.
But they don't always listen to us, you know? They give us pushback. But it's not a perfect world. It's not, but it's the education system we have is better than a lot of other places.
Yeah.
So, what about at home, like for our listeners, like any tips for caregivers, whether it be the parents or grandparents or foster
Mhm.
parents, like how can they make their homes more
Yeah.
neurodiverse
Yeah.
affirming?
So first of all, acknowledging that it is not easy, and it's not easy for parents and caregivers of neurotypical kids. And in this environment, right, these are great schools around us. And also there's so much pressure and so much anxiety, and our kids are depleted. And again, true for neurotypical kids, even more true for neurodivergent kids coming home outside of the school day and on the weekends. And, for many kids, the actual behavioral challenges come in at home because the kids are holding it together all day at school, right? And so it's that recognition of, okay, this is not happening because my kid is being bad. My kid is not trying to be defiant. My kid is not even mad at me, even if they're saying or doing things that feel, aggressive and hurtful. They are depleted and out of control, and we are their safe space. And so it's allowing home to be, as much as possible, that safe landing place. So this is a space where they can, engage as much as possible in their special interests, where the pressure can be lower. It is not worth a nightly fight over homework and studying with a parent.
I don't do homework.
Right. And so, some families just opt out of it entirely. Some families just say, whatever the kid does is what it's going to be. I'm not going to help because it creates more tension. Now, some kids want that help from their parents, and that's great to give too if the child's open to it. But it may also be like, if there's a way to do it and afford it, bringing in that outside help and support for those times, so that the parent-child interaction or caregiver-child interaction is not a constant fight. But it's a lot of letting go of demands, creating a more what we call low demand environment where there's not tons of pressure, finding the balance between all of the therapies and, extracurriculars and downtime. Kids are needing, even high schoolers, are needing downtime to engage in the things that they enjoy, to just decompress and relax, and to feel regulated. Spending one-on-one time is something that I also recommend for parents, and letting that be child-led, which is very similar to the therapy that we would be doing. So your kid gets to decide how to use that time, and you put away distractions. That is a time when, other family members, unless there's an emergency, can't interrupt. They're not allowed to. And that is a time when, phones are away and computers are away, and we're not allowing distraction. We are with our kid, and we're letting our kids show us or talk to us about whatever they need or want to. And we're creating that. And in doing that, we're building rapport, we're building attachment, we're building connection that helps our kiddos and allows for co-regulation. We are also hopefully creating a non-judgmental space. That is another thing parents can do. If you get in trouble at school, know that you're not going to come home and get in trouble with me too. I'm going to help you problem solve. There may be times where you have to take accountability, yes, and kind of deal with the consequence that came up, but I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to help you figure out what happened, why, and how it can be different next time in a way that works for you. That helps children tremendously. So focusing on connection is key. I would move away from reward and punishment systems at home as much as possible. And if rewards and incentives happen to work for your kids, which some ADHD'ers really need things incentivized, then think about how to do it in that non-shaming way, in that you're always working towards something. There's not some cutoff, and you're never taking away something that was already earned as a consequence. Looking for logical consequences, natural consequences, rather than punishments. Things just happen. Like, there are natural consequences. Kiddo doesn't get, doesn't get the things done that they need to, and they don't end up with screen time before bed because they ran themselves out of time. Like, that's really hard, but that's not a parent imposed punishment of no screen time for you, but rather we're just out of time. It's bedtime. Looks very, very different and feels very, very different. You still may get a meltdown and dysregulation, but there's still a sense of trust there. It's not punitive. You're not damaging the relationship in the process.
Right. And it's setting the expectations beforehand.
Yes.
Like,
100%.
you have until this time, and this time is bedtime.
Yeah.
So, but you need to do this first before, anything else. And that usually works for my kids. And the me time, we call it me time.
Yeah.
That's what my girls like it, that they get me time. And it's like, we do 10 or 15 minutes, each girl with each parent.
Yes.
And then we switch.
Yeah.
And it's whatever they want. The phones are away.
Perfect. That's perfect.
Almost
and
all the time it turns into more.
It can be that short. It can be 10 or 15 minutes, but if you're doing that regularly, that creates such an incredible, point of contact and a bond. And if there are multiple caregivers, having that with each child, with each caregiver is wonderful. Maybe it can't be every day. You do the best you can. And I think that's the other thing that I would add for caregivers is you touched on setting expectations. Yes, set expectations, know what they are, and bring your kids into that. What are the household rules and expectations? Let them be part of it. Collaborate with them. And then also get your own needs met. And I don't want to say self-care because it's too buzzy. Like no one really knows what that means, but really leaning into how are you getting support? Where is your support system? How are you caring for yourself? What are the needs that you have to meet in order to show up for your kids? And sometimes it's like, well, I don't have time for that. But often that time that you're putting into it, it may take away from your kids, but then you're showing up in a way when you're there that is far more quality and connected. And so looking for those things, small moments and larger moments to care for yourself so that you can show up and do the best you can. And having compassion for yourself when you don't, and taking accountability. Teach your kids repair when you mess up, and then try not to beat yourself up. Move forward with compassion.
Yep. No, it's so true. It's we're tough on ourselves. We all
so
know
hard on
we're the
ourselves,
worst, right?
Yeah.
We're our hardest critics.
And we
This has
often
been
just
so-
take in negative messaging. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, it's okay. No, I was just looking at the time and like, this
Yeah.
has just been so great. And I knew it because I said at the beginning, we're going to wind up talking forever if we don't
Yeah.
pay attention.
Yeah.
And this has just been so helpful. And I always say like on the professional level and the personal level, both my kids are neurodiverse, and it just, every time I speak to somebody new, it's like, oh wait, there's a little nugget, know?
Yeah.
And that's my thing is that as parents, we're not going to be able to do everything that everybody suggests. There's so much information out there, but say, hey, that might work for me, and try one thing, one little thing a week, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Make all the difference.
Exactly. 100%. It's so important to be able to take it in, use what works for us when it works for us, and ease up on ourselves when we can't.
Yeah, exactly. So this has been so wonderful. How can people get in touch with you if they're like, oh, I need testing, or I think my kid needs therapy? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Our website has a contact form. So going through the website is probably the easiest way. We are playfultherapy.net. Pretty easy to find. And so if you go there, you have a lot of information, and you also can contact us, the phone numbers, the emails, but also the contact form.
Awesome. And that will be in the show notes when we're fully published. Thank you so much, Jaclyn, for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Frances Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through shefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.